What comes to mind when you hear the phrase, the Belle Époque? For many of us, it conjures a perfect golden age, a time of glittering Parisian parties, of wide gaslit boulevards filled with beautiful people and carefree artists sketching in cafes, a glass of absinthe close at hand. It is an image of optimism, of carefree leisure, and boundless creativity. Tonight, we are stepping onto those very gaslit boulevards. But we are going to look closer. We are going behind the gilded facade to discover the exhilarating and often anxious reality of a world on the very brink of profound change. It is wonderful to have you here with us tonight. We have such a curious and supportive community, and I always love to know where you are all settling in from. So, if you feel like it, feel free to share what city or country you're listening from and what time it is for you in your corner of the world. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, find a comfortable spot, perhaps dim the lights, and let your mind begin to drift. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we journey back to the turn of the 20th century to explore what life in the Belle Époque was really like. We begin our journey at the event that announced this new age to the world, a spectacle of iron and ambition rising above the Paris skyline. Our story starts in 1889. Paris is alive, buzzing with an energy not seen in years. The city is hosting the Exposition Universelle, or the World's Fair, an event of staggering scale and ambition. This is not just any celebration. The fair is timed with precision, designed to mark the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. It is a declaration not just of French history, but of the power of the Republic and the promise of a new industrial future. To create a centerpiece for this grand statement, a competition was held. Over 100 designs were submitted, each proposing a monumental gateway for the fair. But one design was chosen. It was a radical, skeletal structure of iron, proposed by the brilliant engineer Gustave Eiffel. His vision was not for a stone arch or a classical monument. It was for a tower. The construction itself was a marvel of the modern age. In an astonishing record time of just 2 years, 2 months, and 5 days, Eiffel's vision rose from the earth. The Champ de Mars, once a quiet public park, was transformed into a deafening symphony of industry. The sound of thousands of hammers echoed across the city, the rapid-fire punctuation of riveting guns as 2.5 million rivets were hammered into place, binding over 18,000 individual pieces of wrought iron. When it was inaugurated, it stood at 300 meters, or 984 feet. It was the tallest man-made structure in the world, snatching the title from the Washington Monument. It was a feat of mathematics, engineering, and relentless organization. But not everyone was impressed. In fact, many were horrified. The tower was a defiant symbol of the new industrial age, and it deeply offended the artistic sensibilities of old Paris. A committee of 300, one member for each meter of the tower's height, was formed in protest. It was led by the most prominent artists and writers of the day, including the famous author Guy de Maupassant. They published a petition, a furious letter titled "Artists Against the Eiffel Tower." They did not hold back. They called it a truly tragic street lamp, a gigantic black smokestack, and a hateful column of bolted metal that would dominate Paris like a dark, looming shadow. They saw it as a temporary scar on their beautiful city. And temporary was, in fact, the entire point. The Eiffel Tower was never meant to be permanent. It was built with a permit that lasted for only 20 years, and it was fully scheduled to be demolished in 1909. It was a piece of magnificent, disposable architecture. So why is it still there? It was saved not by its beauty, but by its utility. In the intervening years, a new technology had emerged, and the tower proved to be the most valuable antenna in the world. It was invaluable as a radio-telegraph transmitter, a vital node in a new, invisible network of communication. The ugly smokestack had become essential, but on its opening day, none of this was certain. All that was certain was the structure itself. Gustav Eiffel, his heart pounding with pride, led a group of dignitaries up the tower. There were no elevators to the very top just yet, so he led them, flag in hand, up the winding, seemingly endless 1,710 steps. Imagine their climb, the smell of hot metal and the grease from the new steam-powered elevators that served the lower levels, the wind whistling through the iron lattice, a sound no one had ever heard before. And then the view, the feeling of pure vertigo as they looked down from the open-air platforms, seeing Paris spread out below them, not as a city, but as a map. At the base of the tower, the fair pulsed with life, the vibrant colors of the Gallery of Machines, a massive iron and glass hall that was itself a marvel, stretched out beside it. And as dusk fell, the new gas lamps flickered on, illuminating the tower's base and casting long skeletal shadows that stretched halfway across the city. The new age had begun. The 1889 fair was a triumph of iron and steam, but it was only a prelude. It was a dress rehearsal for what was to come. 11 years later, as the world prepared to turn the page on a new century, Paris would aim to outdo itself. It would host another, even grander, Exposition Universelle in 1900. This time, the star of the show would not be iron. It would be a new, magical, and invisible force that was about to change the world forever. Electricity. If the 1889 fair was ambitious, the 1900 exposition was a spectacle of almost unimaginable proportions. It was the largest and most ambitious fair the world had ever seen, a sprawling city of wonders that attracted over 50 million visitors. And at the heart of it all, standing on the banks of the Seine, was the star attraction, the Palais de l'Électricité, the Palace of Electricity. It was a building that seemed to be made of pure light. Its enormous, ornate facade was covered in 5,000 multicolored incandescent lamps. Imagine the scene at twilight, the crowds gathering, the sky darkening to a deep velvet blue. And then a switch is thrown. The collective, audible gasp of the crowd as the entire building bursts into a dazzling, man-made constellation, brighter than anything they had ever seen. Gaslight was yellow and dim. This was white, clear, and powerful. Atop the palace, a glowing 6.5-meter tall statue presided over the scene. It was the fée Electricity, the fairy of electricity, a new goddess for a new age, her hand raised to the sky. But the real miracle was inside. The palace was not just a decorated box. It was the power station for the entire fair. Visitors walked into a massive dynamo hall, a thrumming, humming temple to new technology. The air was filled with a distinct, low electric hum, a sound that was completely new to human ears. You could smell the sharp, clean scent of ozone, a byproduct of the massive, sparking generators that lined the hall. These engines, themselves a spectacle, were powering the entire future. And what a future it was! The electricity generated in this building powered the luminous fountains out front. Massive jets of water, illuminated by powerful colored beams, synchronized in a magical, shifting dance. It powered the electric-powered boats, the bateaux-mouches, that glided silently on the river Seine, turning the water into a ribbon of light. And it powered the trottoir roulant, or the moving walkway. This was, for many, the most bizarre and delightful attraction of all. It was a 3.5-kilometer, or 2.2-mile, elevated loop that transported people around the fairgrounds. It was not a simple ride. It had two speeds, running side by side. A slower platform moved at 4.2 kilometers per hour, and a faster one at 8.5. To use it, you had to step from the stationary ground onto the slow platform, and then, if you were brave, lurch from the slow platform to the fast one. The sight was one of pure, chaotic comedy. People laughed and stumbled. Women, constrained by their long, heavy skirts, found the leap especially challenging. The jerky, shuffling motion of the crowds, the laughter and squeals of people trying to mount it, all became part of the fun. It was the future, and it was slightly ridiculous. This was the world that welcomed the new century. Thomas Edison himself was there, holding his own exhibit to showcase his phonograph, letting people hear recorded sound for the first time. The fair also celebrated the opening of the very first Paris metro line, Line 1, a new underground electric railway that promised to move people beneath the city with unprecedented speed. The whole event was a breathtaking fantasy. It was also incredibly expensive. The fair cost over 18 million francs, a staggering sum that was barely recouped by ticket sales. It was a glorious, fleeting, and financially ruinous dream. But it had done its job. It had shown millions of people a future that ran not on steam or muscle, but on a clean, quiet, and magical new power. This new electric world was not just for grand expositions. It was slowly beginning to filter down, changing how people lived, socialized, and shopped. It was illuminating the streets, and it was helping to create the vibrant daily spectacle of the grand Parisian boulevards. The Paris of the Belle Époque, the one we picture in our minds, is the city of wide, tree-lined boulevards. These were the result of a massive and controversial urban renovation project led by Baron Haussmann decades earlier. Between 1853 and 1870, his project had torn down the old medieval city and replaced it with the open, airy, and modern capital. By the time of the Belle Époque, this new urban layout had created a new kind of urban life. It was a stage for a new kind of character, the flâneur. This was a French term for a man of leisure, a gentleman who would spend his days doing seemingly nothing at all. He would stroll the boulevards, not to get anywhere, but simply to observe, to see, and, of course, to be seen. He was a detached, ambling spectator of modern life. And his natural habitat was the café. Café culture exploded in this era. Places like the famous Café de la Paix, located near the Grand Opera, were the centers of social life. They were places of business, of gossip, of artistic debate, and of simple people-watching. The air was thick with the smell of strong coffee and roasted chestnuts from a curbside vendor. The soundtrack of the city was a constant, lively clatter, the clip-clop of horses pulling omnibuses over the cobblestone streets, the rustle of silk dresses as elegant women passed by, the sharp tap-tap-tapping of walking sticks on the pavement. Even the waiters in these cafes were a part of the spectacle. They were famously, almost theatrically skilled, able to remember complex orders for large groups without ever writing a single thing down, balancing impossible trays of drinks with practiced grace. But the boulevards were also home to a new, revolutionary kind of building. This was the Grand Magasin, the department store, and the first and most famous was Le Bon Marché. Its founder, Aristide Bouchicot, did not just create a store. He created an entire new culture of shopping. He introduced concepts that were, at the time, completely revolutionary. He introduced fixed prices, so customers no longer had to haggle. He offered home delivery, and most importantly, he had a satisfait ou remboursé, a satisfied or refunded policy, which built a new kind of trust with the public. But his greatest innovation was turning shopping itself into a form of leisure, a spectacle. Le Bon Marché was designed as a cathedral of commerce. It was a fantasy world. It had grand, sweeping staircases, massive atriums made of glass and iron that let in the daylight, and, of course, the new electric lighting that made everything sparkle. The air inside was a heady mix, the scent of 100 different perfumes mingling in the main hall. Bouchicot's strategy was to make the store a place you would want to spend the entire day. He was a genius of customer psychology. He installed reading rooms, stocked with newspapers, for husbands to wait in while their wives shopped. He created play areas for children. He encouraged people to just look around without any pressure to buy. The stores created seasonal desire, launching new collections and mounting elaborate, dazzling window displays. These windows were like fantasy worlds under glass, showing off the latest fashions and goods in theatrical scenes. Other giants soon followed. Printemps famously installed the first elevators, turning the simple act of moving between floors into a thrill. Galeries Lafayette would later open its own magnificent store, crowned with an iconic, soaring glass dome. These stores were not just places to buy things. They were destinations, dreams made of glass, iron, and merchandise. This was the Paris of the respectable, wealthy bourgeoisie, a world of elegant leisure, conspicuous consumption, and polite society. But this was only one side of the city. While the kings of the boulevard sipped their coffee and admired the new window displays, another, more scandalous and vibrant world was thriving just a short walk away, up the steep, winding hill of Montmartre. If the grand boulevards were the city's respectable face, Montmartre was its rebellious, artistic heart. It had originally been a rustic village outside the city limits, with its own windmills and vineyards. It was only annexed into Paris in 1860, and it never lost its rustic, slightly wild character. Because of this, its rents were famously low, which made it a magnet for the city's artists, writers, poets, and performers. It was the home of the bohemian, a term for those who lived a life of art, freedom, and poverty, in defiance of the conservative norms of the society below. The air up here smelled different. It was a mix of cheap wine, strong tobacco smoke, and the distinct, oily scent of artists' turpentine. And in 1889, the very same year, the Eiffel Tower shocked the city. A new landmark opened its doors in Montmartre. It, too, had a purely decorative and instantly iconic feature on its roof, a large, bright red windmill. This was the Moulin Rouge, the Red Mill. Its creators, Charles Zeidler and Joseph Aller, had a clear vision. They wanted to create a palace of women and dance, a place that would be the biggest and most beautiful of cabarets, a place where the rich and the artistic could mix, and where the rules of the boulevards did not apply. the Moulin Rouge became the birthplace of the modern can-can. This was a scandalous high-energy and deliberately provocative dance. A line of women would kick their legs high, their ruffled white petticoats and black stockings, a frantic, exhilarating blur, all to the delight of the cheering, shouting audience. Star dancers, with stage names like La Goulou or The Glutton, and the more ethereal Jane Avril, became the first modern celebrities, their faces known throughout the city. The resident artist of this world was Henry de Toulouse-Lautrec. He was a brilliant, eccentric painter who was a regular at the Moulin Rouge every night, his sketchbook always in hand. He captured the frenetic energy, the artificial light, and the exhausted, expressive faces of the performers in his iconic posters, which became famous in their own right. The Moulin Rouge was the most famous, but it was not alone. Just down the street was another legendary cabaret, Le Chat Noir, or the Black Cat. This was a more artistic, intellectual haunt, famous for its theater d'ombres, or shadow puppet plays, which presented sharp, satirical songs and stories. On any given night, the dark, winding streets of Montmartre were alive. The sound of a lone accordion and bursts of raucous laughter spilled out of smoky, crowded rooms. The flashing red light of the windmill acted as a beacon, visible from across the city, promising a world of excitement, art, and scandal. This was a city within a city, a bohemian dream that stood in stark, thrilling contrast to the ordered, elegant world below. We have walked the boulevards of the dream, seen the future in the palace of electricity, and danced at the Red Mill. This is the glittering, exciting, and familiar image of the Belle Époque. It is a story of wonder, of innovation, and of a seemingly endless party. But every story has another, deeper side. Every golden age casts a long shadow. As we move from the spectacle of this gilded dream, I am curious, what other golden ages of history intrigue you? What other times and places feel like they are wrapped in a similar myth? Let me know in the comments, as your ideas and your curiosity truly help shape our future journeys together. We will now begin to look beneath this gilded surface to find the other, more complicated stories waiting in the shadows. But that glittering image of the Belle Époque, the one we explored together, was just that, an image. It was a brilliantly lit stage, and like any stage, it depended on a vast, dark, and unseen world just behind the curtain. The spectacle of the boulevards, the department stores, and the electric fairs was not the whole story. It was, perhaps, not even the most important story. Now, our pace must slow. We must become more deliberate. We leave the bright, wide avenues and turn down a narrow, unlit street. We are going to deconstruct the golden myth, to step behind the facade and into the engine room. We are going to explore the profound, anxious, and jarring contradictions that truly defined this era. The story of the Belle Époque is not just a story of progress. It is a story of the deep, unsettling friction between a dazzling public spectacle and a dark, often desperate, private reality. Our journey into this other world begins just a few steps away from the grandeur we have just left. We step off the grand boulevard, with its gleaming electric lamps and rustling silk dresses, and into the other Paris. We walk away from the light. Instantly, the air changes. The wide, tree-lined avenue gives way to a labyrinth of narrow, sunless streets. The air, once filled with the scent of perfume and coffee, is now heavy. It is thick with the overwhelming smell of uncollected garbage, the acrid, constant sting of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys, and something else, a deeper, more profound foulness. This is the smell of the Biver River, a small tributary of the Seine. But the Biver is not a river of water. It is an open, flowing sewer, its waters famously black and putrid, choked with the chemical runoff from the tanneries and dye-works that line its banks. This is the Paris that Baron Haussmann's grand renovation did not entirely erase. While he had plowed new avenues through the city, much of the old medieval heart remained hidden just behind the new clean facades. Here, the buildings are not elegant mansions, but tall, leaning tenement buildings called lodgements. They press in on one another, their upper floors almost touching, blocking out the sky. The streets are damp, even on a dry day, and a constant, penetrating chill seems to rise from the cobblestones. The sound is different here, too. The cheerful clatter of carriages is replaced by a more human, more somber soundtrack. The constant, hacking sound of coughing echoes from open, unglazed windows. The sharp cries of street vendors, selling not luxuries, but the barest of necessities. And the sound of children, many of them playing barefoot on the dirty, uneven stones, their voices sharp in the cold air. Let us step inside one of these lodgements. We leave the gray light of the street and enter a darkness that feels absolute. The staircase is steep, narrow, and rickety, the wood of the handrail rough and splintered. We climb into the gloom, guided only by the faint light from above. We are in a neighborhood like the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, a district densely packed with the city's working-class families. Many of these families live their entire lives in a single, unfurnished room. The plaster is cracked, the floor is bare, earth or broken tile. There is no running water, there is no sanitation. The only heat comes from a small, inefficient stove that blackens the ceiling with soot. In this one small space, a family of 6, 8, or even 10 might live, work, and sleep. To survive, the work is constant. Many families take in piecework, the most insecure and poorly paid labor the city has to offer. Women and children sit for 12 hours a day, their fingers raw, sewing beads onto a dress for a lady they will never see, or folding and gluing boxes for a department store they will never enter. In these dark, damp, and overcrowded conditions, disease flourished. Tuberculosis, known by the romantic-sounding name consumption, was anything but. It was a plague. It was rampant in these tenements, a leading cause of death that hollowed out families, person by person. The life expectancy for a working-class man in these slums was significantly, shockingly lower than for his bourgeois counterpart, who lived just a 10-minute walk away. There was no safety net, none. If a father, the primary wage earner, fell ill or was injured in an accident, it meant starvation for his entire family. This reality created a grim economy on the streets below. At dawn, the chiffoniers, or rag pickers, were a common sight. Men and women with baskets strapped to their backs, sifting through the city's garbage, poking at the refuse of the wealthy with a long, metal-tipped stick. They were looking for anything: rags, bones, scraps of metal, or half-eaten food. Anything that could be cleaned and resold for a few centimes. Cleanliness itself was a luxury few could afford. Public bathhouses were rare and cost money. Clean drinking water was not a guarantee. Many families still relied on public fountains, queuing with buckets, their water often contaminated. This visible, desperate poverty was not just a tragedy for those who lived it. It was a source of great and constant anxiety for the wealthy. The bourgeois of Paris looked upon these neighborhoods with a mixture of pity, disgust, and profound fear. They feared the diseases that might spread from the slums into their own clean homes, and perhaps even more. They feared the people. They feared social unrest. They feared a revolution, a return to the chaos of the Bastille, which they had only just celebrated. This glittering Belle, Époque, was built on a fault line, a deep, trembling crack in the foundation of society. This vast, struggling population was not idle. They were not simply a problem to be feared. They were the essential human fuel for the new engine of progress. An engine that was running at full speed, day and night, just beneath the city streets, in the new, roaring temples of the Second Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution had been built on textiles, steam, and iron. The Belle Époque was the age of something new. It was the age of steel, of chemicals, and of electricity. This was the Second Industrial Revolution, and it was changing the very nature of work and of life. We are now on the outskirts of the city, in a factory district. The air itself is different. It is thick, hard to breathe. If we are in a textile mill, the air is a fog of cotton dust that coats the lungs. If we are in a chemical plant, it is sharp with acidic fumes that burn the eyes and throat. And if we are in a steel mill, the air is scorched, filled with the smell of hot metal and machine oil. And then there is the noise. It is not just loud, it is a physical assault. It is a rhythmic, deafening, and relentless crash and hiss. The sound of a steam-powered drop hammer, shaking the very ground beneath our feet. The shriek of metal being cut. The thunderous roar of a Bessemer converter, turning iron into steel. Or the chaotic, clattering thunder of 1,000 mechanical looms in a weaving factory. This was a noise so pervasive that it led to permanent hearing loss for nearly everyone who worked there. This was the new workplace. It was not a craftsman's quiet shop. It was a vast, dangerous, and mechanized hall. The machinery was exposed, with spinning belts, grinding gears, and crushing presses. There were no safety regulations. Accidents were a daily, expected occurrence. A moment's inattention, a sleepy eye after a 12-hour shift, could mean a lost finger, a crushed hand, or worse. The workday itself was a feat of endurance. The standard was 10 or 12 hours long, 6 days a week, and your time was not your own. The lives of thousands were controlled by a single piercing sound, the factory whistle. It screamed at dawn, signaling the start of the day, and it screamed again at night, signaling its end. It was the voice of the machine. Inside, a new philosophy of work was taking hold. It was called Taylorism, or scientific management. This was the idea that every job could be broken down into its smallest, most efficient parts. A task that was once performed by a skilled artisan was now analyzed, timed, and divided among 10 different workers. One person did nothing but turn a single screw. Another did nothing but pull a single lever, over and over, all day long. This deskilling of labor had a profound effect. It made workers interchangeable, like parts in the very machines they operated. It destroyed their bargaining power. If you complained, you were fired. There were 100 others, desperate for work, waiting at the factory gate. Child labor, though facing new restrictions, was still common. Children, with their small, nimble fingers, were essential in the textile mills, crawling under the dangerous, moving looms to retie broken threads. This new, mechanized world was a source of deep anxiety. Ludism, the fear that machines were replacing human workers, was a major source of social tension. And this was not an idle fear. It was a daily reality. This period saw the birth of the industrial giants that would define the next century. Companies like Renault, founded in 1899, and Michelin in 1889, were pioneering mass production in France, building the very machines that were changing the world. For the workers, the only recourse was to organize. The labor movement was in its infancy, and strikes were becoming more common. But they were almost always met with brutal force. Factory owners would call in the police, or even the army, to break a strike, to force the workers back to the deafening, dangerous, and relentless roar of the factory. This same industrial engine, the one that consumed the lives of the poor and ground them down with its relentless rhythm, was also doing something else. It was creating wealth, staggering, unimaginable, and entirely new fortunes. It was giving birth to a new, dazzlingly wealthy class, one whose opulence and power rivaled, and in many cases, far surpassed that of the old, blue-blooded aristocracy. While the flaneur strolled the boulevards and the artist starved in Montmartre, a new kind of king was rising in Paris. This was the nouveau rich, the newly rich. These were the industrialists, the bankers, the entrepreneurs, and the global traders. They did not make their money from ancient, inherited land, like the old aristocracy. They made it from steel, from armaments, from railways, from banking, and from the new chemical and electrical industries. Families with names like Rothschild in banking, or de Wendel in steel, or Schneider in armaments, wielded an immense, tangible power. They did not just own businesses, they financed governments and built the infrastructure of the new world, and they spent their money with a passion, with a desperate need to prove they had arrived. This was the age of conspicuous consumption. They built extravagant hotels, particulier or private mansions, especially in the fashionable new neighborhoods like Parc Monceau. Let us imagine we are invited to one of their homes. We step into a cavernous, marble-floored entrance hall. The air is warm. These homes were showcases filled with every conceivable modern convenience. They had the new, bright, electric lighting. They had central heating, a miracle of comfort. Some even had their own private, hydraulic elevators, lined with velvet. The house is a small fortress of luxury, run by a hushed, efficient, and unseen army of servants in crisp uniforms. Their footsteps are silent on the thick, plush carpets that cover every floor. We are led into a grand salon, a room of dizzying opulence. The furniture is new, heavy, and richly upholstered in silk and velvet. The walls are covered in grand historical paintings, as this new class were major patrons of the arts. But they often favored the academic art, the grand, polished, and respectable paintings, over the new, scandalous, and sketchy works of the Impressionists. The smell in this room is one of pure, settled wealth. The scent of expensive cigars, of fine brandy, and of the beeswax used to polish the acres of dark, carved wood. Later, we are summoned to dinner. It is a lavish 12-course affair, served on silver platters, the table groaning under the weight of heavy crystal and arrangements of exotic flowers imported from the south of France. A string quartet plays softly from an alcove, the sound echoing perfectly off the waxed parquet floor of the adjoining ballroom, which is being prepared for the night's entertainment, a ball for 500 guests. This new elite was also highly international. They had homes not just in Paris, but in London, in New York, and on the sunny French Riviera. Their wealth was global, and they used it to buy their way into the one thing they did not possess: status. The old, blue-blooded aristocracy, whose families had ruled France for centuries, often looked down on this new, rich. They saw them as uncultured, gaudy, and vulgar. Their money was too new, their manners too loud. But the old aristocracy was also, quite often, poor. Their land no longer produced the wealth it once did, and so a quiet, cynical trade began. This was the era of the great transatlantic marriages. American heiresses, daughters of steel magnates and railroad barons, like the famous Consuelo Vanderbilt, were married off to titled but poor European aristocrats. The heiresses traded their new money for an ancient, respected title. This entire complex and status-obsessed social world, with all its anxieties, snobberies, and hidden passions, was brilliantly and mercilessly chronicled by the novelist Marcel Proust, whose great work In Search of Lost Time is the ultimate literary monument to this gilded and deeply troubled society. These two worlds, which seemed so separate, were about to collide. The grinding, roaring poverty of the factory and the effortless, insulated luxury of the new elite were about to meet on the cobblestone streets of Paris. They would collide in a very noisy, dusty, chaotic, and revolutionary way, with the arrival of a startling and slightly terrifying new machine. In the 1890s, they were called horseless carriages. They were a rare, handmade, and obscenely expensive luxury item. The first automobiles. Today, we see a car as a simple fact of life. To the people of the Belle Époque, it was a profound disruption. It was a noisy, smelly, and often terrifying symbol of the new century. Imagine a street in 1895. The sounds are of horses, of wooden wheels on stone, of human voices. Suddenly, this new machine appears. It sputters, it shakes, and it lets out a sudden, loud bang of a backfire, a sound like a gunshot that scatters pigeons and sends pedestrians scrambling. It leaves behind a trail of blue smoke and a completely new smell that hangs in the air. The sharp, chemical scent of gasoline, hot oil, and scorched rubber. The public was, at first, horrified. These devil wagons were a public nuisance. They were loud, they were unreliable, and they were constantly breaking down, blocking traffic. But their greatest sin was that they terrified the horses. Horses were the engine of the 19th century city. They pulled the carriages, the omnibuses, the delivery wagons, and when one of these new automobiles rattled past, a horse would rear in panic, its eyes wide with terror, causing countless accidents. The drivers of the horse-drawn fiacres or cabs were the mortal enemies of these first motorists. The cars themselves were incredibly complex to operate. They required a chauffeur. This was not just a driver. It was a trained mechanic. The very word chauffeur in French means to heat. The chauffeur's first job was to manually heat the engine to get it started. Then, he had to manage a complex array of levers and pedals, all while steering with a stiff tiller, not yet a wheel, and keeping the unreliable engine from stalling. Pedestrians were completely unused to this new form of traffic. They were accustomed to vehicles moving at the pace of a horse. They would step into the street without looking, leading to the first tragic automobile-related accidents. The speed was alarming. In 1895, the first automobile race, from Paris to Bordeaux and back, was held, proving that these machines had the potential for long-distance travel, that they were not just a city toy. In some places, red flag laws, which had originated in the United Kingdom, were adopted. These laws required a person to walk in front of the car, waving a red flag by day and a lantern by night to warn pedestrians of its approach. This, of course, defeated the entire purpose of the machine's speed. But the wealthy elite embraced the car with a passion. It was the ultimate status symbol, the ultimate expression of modernity and conspicuous consumption. They began to engage in automotive touring, driving their new X machines into the countryside. This required an entirely new wardrobe. Men and women wore heavy dust coats, goggles, and hats tied on with veils, all to protect themselves from the clouds of dust and mud kicked up from the unpaved roads. Innovations came quickly. Renault's 1898 Voiturette, or small car, featured a revolutionary direct-drive gearbox, making the car more practical and reliable. By 1900, Paris even had a small taxi fleet of fiacres automobiles, many of which were surprisingly electric, their quiet hum a strange contrast to their gasoline-powered cousins. The arrival of the car changed the city's soundscape forever. The incessant, abrasive honking of rubber bullhorns became the new, jarring music of the boulevards. It was the sound of the 20th century, arriving ahead of schedule. It was fast, it was anxious, it was loud, and it was replacing the old world, whether people liked it or not. The hum of the factory, the roar of the automobile, the jarring, bone-rattling vibration of new machines, the stark, silent division between the new rich and the desperate poor. This was a disorienting, confusing, and fast-changing world. It is fascinating to think about which sounds we find comforting and which ones we find jarring. The sounds of our own time are so familiar, while the sounds of the past, like the clip-clop of 1,000 horses, are now the stuff of fantasy. As we let that thought settle, we will turn to how the people of this anxious, disorienting era tried to make sense of it all. How they tried to capture this new reality through new ways of seeing, new ways of building, and new ways of dreaming. And so, how did they make sense of it all? In a world that had become so loud, so fast, so full of jarring, anxious motion, how did the human mind and the human heart find a way to process it? How did they cope with the roar of the factory, the shriek of the automobile, and the stark, unsettling contrast of the slum and the palace? They did what people have always done. They created, they responded, they found new ways of seeing to capture the speed. They found new ways of building to soften the hard edges of the new industrial world. And they invented entirely new ways of dreaming to capture and share their new reality with the world. Our pace now becomes quieter, more reflective. The great, grinding engine of industry fades just a little into the background. And in its place, if we listen carefully, we can begin to hear the quieter, more human sounds, the soft, rhythmic scrape of a paintbrush on canvas, the smooth carve of a chisel in wood, and the gentle, rhythmic click and clatter of a brand new machine, one that would capture light itself. We are entering the true cultural heart of the Belle Epoque. We are here not to look at pretty, decorative objects, but to understand the profound human response to the great, anxious machine. Our first stop is in a sun-drenched studio, or perhaps it is not a studio at all. Perhaps we are outdoors, on the bank of the River Seine. The air is warm, and there is a gentle breeze, just enough to make the tall grasses shiver and the water sparkle. We can smell the sharp, clean scent of linseed oil and turpentine, a scent that mixes with the earthy smell of the riverbank. This is the world of the Impressionists. Before this time, a painting was a serious, formal, and dark affair. The academic style, loved by the old aristocracy and the new rich alike, was all about recreating history, grand, polished, and dramatic scenes from mythology or the ancient past, all painted with invisible brushstrokes in the dim, controlled light of a studio. A group of new, rebellious artists looked at this style, and they felt it had nothing to say about the world they actually lived in. Their world was not dark and still. It was bright, and it was moving. It was the blur of a crowd on the boulevard. It was the white puff of steam from a departing train. It was the fleeting, shimmering light on the surface of the water. They were called the Impressionists, and the name, at first, was a deep insult. It came from a painting by Claude Monet, finished in 1872. He called it Impression, Soleil Levant, impression, sunrise. A critic seized on the word impression, and he used it to mock these new painters. He said their work was unfinished, that it was just an impression, that it was messy, childish, and blurry. And the artists, in a brilliant act of defiance, said, yes, that is exactly the point. They rejected the dark, heavy, and history-focused academic style. They were obsessed with something much more immediate. They were obsessed with light. They took their easels in plein air or outdoors into the world. This simple act was, in itself, a revolution, and it was a revolution made possible by a humble, modern invention, the prepackaged paint tube. Much like a modern toothpaste tube, this new technology allowed artists to carry their colors with them. They were no longer chained to their studios, grinding and mixing their own pigments. They could leave the building, and so they did. They sat in fields, on railway bridges, and at outdoor cafes. Their goal was to capture the subjective, fleeting sensation of a single moment. Not the thing itself, but the way the light hit the thing. Not the cathedral, but the way the sunlight at 5 o'clock dissolved its stone facade into a haze of purple and gold. This was a profound, direct response to the new speed of life. The world was moving faster. A ride on a train had shown people a new way of seeing. The world rushing past, a blur of color and form. The Impressionists painted this new reality. Look at a painting by Claude Monet, one of his late water lilies. Stand close, and it is a chaotic mess of thick paint. But step back, and the light, the water, and the flower all shimmer into focus. It is a moment captured. Think of the work of Edgar Degas. He was a man of the city. He was not interested in fields or rivers. He was fascinated by modern urban life. He painted the ballet dancers, but not the final, grand performance. He painted the quiet, dusty light of the rehearsal studio, capturing a moment of exhaustion, a dancer adjusting her shoe. He painted the world of the cafe concerts, the gaudy, artificial light on a performer's face, the bored, lonely look of a woman sipping her drink. This new way of seeing was also a response to another new technology, the camera. The rise of photography had created a crisis for painters. If a machine could capture a perfect, flawless representation of reality, what was the painter left to do? The Impressionists found the answer. They would paint what the camera could not capture. They would paint feeling, light, and motion. This revolution was not welcome. These artists were consistently rejected by the official salon, the grand government-sponsored art show. So they mounted their own independent exhibitions, which were, at first, a critical and financial disaster. People laughed at their work, but they inspired the next wave. The post-impressionists, like Vincent van Gogh or Georges Seurat, or Paul Cézanne, they took this new freedom and pushed it even further. They began to use color and form, not to represent reality, but to express their own internal emotion. Van Gogh's swirling, electric kilo stars were not the stars he saw, but the stars he felt. And George's Seurat, with his pointillism, created a style that was almost scientific. His massive, famous painting, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, is composed of millions of tiny individual dots of pure color. He was fascinated by the new scientific theories of optics. He believed that if he placed the dots side by side, the viewer's eye would mix them, creating a more vibrant, more real light. It is a stunning, static, and silent work. It is almost like an early form of digital pixelation, a scientific response to the question of light itself. This new way of seeing was a deep, reflective, and beautiful answer to the chaos of the New World. It was an art that said, "Stop, look, see the beauty in this one fleeting, ordinary moment before it is gone." This desire to find a new human and fleeting feeling was not just confined to the canvas. It began to shape the very world people lived in. It began to change the design of their furniture, the look of their jewelry, and the very entrances to the new underground world of the city. If the Eiffel Tower was the symbol of the new industrial age, all hard, functional, and metallic, then the new style, Art Nouveau, was its opposite. It was a conscious, deliberate reaction against the machine. It was an attempt to bring beauty, nature, and organic, flowing forms back into a world that was becoming increasingly angular, mass-produced, and functional. Art Nouveau, or New Art, was a total art style. It was not just for buildings, it was applied to everything: furniture, glass, jewelry, graphic design, and posters. It is defined by its sinuous, flowing, and whiplash lines. These are lines inspired by nature, but a dreamlike, stylized nature. The curve of a vine, the petals of a lily, the translucent wings of a dragonfly, the flowing hair of a woman. This was a rebellion against the styles of the past. It rejected the rigid historical revival styles, like the neo-Gothic or the neoclassical, which were seen as stale and old-fashioned, and it rejected the ugly, purely functional forms of the factory and the iron bridge. It wanted to find a third way, a modern art for a modern age. In Paris, its most famous practitioner was the architect Hector Guimard, and he was given a commission that would define the look of the city. He was hired to design the entrances for the new Paris Metro, the underground railway. What he created was astonishing. He did not build simple, functional sheds. He created gateways of cast iron and glass that look less like buildings and more like fantastical, alien plants. He created what became known as the Guimard style. The railings are made of green-painted cast iron that looks like it is still growing, twisting up from the ground like the stalks of a strange flower. The canopies, which cover the entrances, are made of glass, held in place by delicate iron ribs that look like the wings of a dragonfly. And at night, the two lamps on either side of the entrance would glow like the glowing, insect-like eyes of some beautiful, subterranean creature. He took an industrial material, cast iron, and he forced it, he shaped it, into an organic, living form. This philosophy was everywhere. In the decorative arts, glassmakers like René Lalique and Emile Gall created the most stunning, dreamlike pieces. They made vases that looked like they were captured in mist, and brooches, designed by Lalique, that were not symmetrical, perfect gems, but organic, asymmetrical forms, an exotic flower, or a beautiful jeweled insect. And on the streets, the poster itself became a high art form. The artist Alphonse Mucha, in his posters for the actress Sarah Bernhardt, defined the graphic look of the era. His women are surrounded by flowing, intricate lines, where their own hair seems to melt into the decorative border, all one single, flowing, organic line. This style was truly international. It was called Jugendstil, or youth style, in Germany. It was style liberty in Italy. It was a global, coordinated attempt to find a new, beautiful, and human-shaped language for the modern world. The 1900 Paris Exposition, the one with the Great Palace of Electricity, was the absolute peak of the Art Nouveau style. Many of its grand, temporary pavilions were built in this swirling, dreamlike form. It was, perhaps, too beautiful to last. It was incredibly expensive to produce, a style of bespoke, handmade craftsmanship in an age that was moving inexorably toward mass production. But for a brief, shining moment, it was a profound, elegant, and soothing answer to the roar of the machine. It was a way of saying, we can be modern, but we will not be ugly. Artists and architects were changing how people saw their surroundings, how they saw art, and how they saw their own homes. But a brand new technology, born in this very moment, was about to change something even more fundamental. It was about to change how people saw and shared stories. It was about to change the nature of the public stream. Our story now takes us into a small, dark, and crowded room. We are in the basement of the Grand Café in Paris, in a room called the Salon Indien, the Indian Salon. The date is December 28, 1895. The air is warm and a little stuffy, thick with the smell of hot, dusty velvet and the faint, sweet scent of tobacco smoke. A small group of people have paid 1 franc each to be here. They are not entirely sure what they have paid to see. They are here for a demonstration of a new invention by 2 brothers, Auguste and Louis Lumière. They call it the cinematography. It is a strange, portable wooden box. It is a camera, a film projector, and a film developer, all in one. The lights go down. A beam of white light cuts through the smoky air, and on a simple white sheet hung on the far wall, an image appears. It is black and white, it is grainy, and it is moving. The first film shown that night was called Workers Leaving the Lumière Factory. It was 50 seconds long, and it showed exactly that. A stream of men and women, real people, walking out of a factory gate, laughing, talking, and looking at the camera. For the audience, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated magic. They were not watching a play. They were not looking at a painting. They were looking at real life, captured and replayed. 10 short films were shown that night. Films of a baby being fed, a wall being demolished, and then, in a trick, magically rebuilding itself. But the most famous film, one that would be shown later, was L'arrivée d'une train en gare de la Chotat, the arrival of a train at La Chotat station. The camera is placed on the platform. A train, in the distance, approaches. It gets closer and closer and closer, until the massive, smoking engine seems to be coming right out of the screen, right into the room. A legend, which is perhaps not true but tells a deeper truth, says that the audiences screamed, they ducked, they scrambled out of their chairs, terrified that the train was about to hit them. They were seeing, for the first time, a new language, the language of motion, of perspective, of the close-up. This new invention captured the era's fascination with motion and spectacle, and it delivered it to a mass audience. Initially, these films were just actualities, simple, short scenes of daily life. But one man who was in that first audience, a magician named Georges Méliès, saw something else. He did not see reality, he saw fantasy, he saw the potential for magic. He was the one who invented special effects, starting and stopping the camera to make things appear and disappear and disappear. In 1902, he would create the first great fantasy film, A Trip to the Moon, with its iconic, whimsical image of a spaceship hitting the man in the moon right in the eye. By 1900, cinemas were popping up everywhere. They were in fairgrounds, in vaudeville halls, in converted shops. The experience was defined by the rhythmic, mechanical clatter of the hand-cranked projector and the sound of a live piano player sitting in the dark, improvising music to try and match the mood of the silent, flickering images on the screen. The audience would gasp, they would laugh, they would cheer, and they would applaud, all together in the dark. This was, perhaps, the first truly democratic art form. You did not have to be rich to see it. And, most importantly, in an age when literacy was still not universal, you did not even need to know how to read. It spoke a universal language. It was a public dream, a magical, wondrous, and deeply soothing escape. The moving image, the painted canvas, the living, breathing building, they all relied on one much older invention. An invention that had, in the Belle Époque, reached its absolute zenith. This was the printed word, and it was this technology that brought the news of this strange, fast, and electric new world to millions of people every single day. This was the golden age of the newspaper. For centuries, newspapers had been for the wealthy and the elite. But now, two things had changed. First, in countries like France, the Jules Ferry laws had established compulsory, free public education. For the first time, a vast, newly literate population was emerging, hungry for things to read. Second, the technology of printing had become incredibly fast and incredibly cheap. New inventions like the rotary press, a massive, roaring machine, and the linotype machine, which allowed printers to set type automatically, had revolutionized the industry. This led to the birth of the petty journal, the small, cheap daily paper. In Paris, Le Petit Journal was the pioneer. In 1886, it became the first newspaper in the world to reach a daily circulation of 1 million copies. These papers were not the dry, political journals of the past. They were sensational. They pioneered the use of large, dramatic headlines to grab your attention. The cry of the newsboy on the street corner, shouting the day's most sensational headline, became a new sound of the city. The papers were how people lived their lives. They followed the new, seasonal fashions. They got the sports scores. They read novels, which were published in short, daily installments, or serialized, leaving the reader on a cliffhanger every single day. And the Sunday supplement of Le Petit Journal was famous for its vivid, full-color illustrations of the week's most dramatic and often most gruesome news. These newspapers wielded an immense and often terrifying political power. They were capable of making or breaking careers, of starting public panics, or of driving a national conversation. This was the age of yellow press in the United States, a time of scandal-driven, sensational journalism that blurred the line between fact and entertainment. This new, shared mediosphere connected people in a way that had never been possible. A farmer in the south of France could read the same news at the same time as a banker in Paris. It created a new, shared sense of reality. And on the streets, the posters created by artists like Toulouse-Lautrec and Mucha were papered over every available wall on the new cylindrical Morris columns, turning the city itself into a kind of open-air newspaper, a riot of color and text. The quiet, private rustle of thousands of pages turning, almost in unison, on the morning metro. Art. This was the sound of the new, informed, and connected public. And so, the painters, the architects, the filmmakers, and the journalists of the Belle Époque all tried, in their own way, to capture their electric, fleeting, and anxious world. A world of intense light and profound shadow. A world of breathless progress and deep, gnawing poverty. They were not just creating art. They were not just selling papers. They were trying to understand. They were trying to shape a new, shared reality, to make sense of the beautiful, terrifying, and confusing machine of the modern world. It has been a true pleasure guiding you through this beautiful, complex time, a time that, in so many ways, set the stage for the very world we know today. I hope you are feeling relaxed, at peace, and perhaps just a little sleepy. As our main story finds its resting place, I will be back in just a quiet moment to explore the one last shadow we have not yet touched, the deep political anxieties that lurked just beneath this glittering artistic surface. It will be a gentle epilogue for those of you who are still listening. But as our journey through this beautiful epoch comes to a gentle close, we must reflect on a different aspect of the age. Because beneath the glittering surface of this world, beneath the laughter of the boulevards and the bright glow of the gas lamps, there were deep, hidden fractures. The Belle Époque was not golden for everyone, and for those who looked closely, the signs of anxiety, of deep-seated social and political tensions, were everywhere. The confidence was real, but it was not universal. It was a confidence that often existed alongside a profound unease about the future. This era of unprecedented progress was also an era of profound division. And nothing exposed these hidden fault lines more starkly or more painfully than a single divisive scandal. A scandal that would tear a nation apart and become known to history simply as the affair. Our story, this quiet reflection, begins in the year 1894. It begins not with an artist, but with a soldier, Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He was a promising artillery officer attached to the general staff of the French army. He was also Jewish, and in an army and a society where anti-Semitism pulsed just beneath the surface, this fact made him a target. In 1894, Dreyfus was suddenly and shockingly accused of treason. He was charged with passing military secrets to the German embassy in Paris. The evidence was flimsy, a single handwritten memorandum that was later found to have been written by someone else. But the Army High Command needed a scapegoat, and Dreyfus, the outsider, was the perfect choice. He was convicted in a secret court-martial. His fate was sealed. The punishment was not just imprisonment, it was public humiliation, a ritual designed to destroy a man's identity. In the courtyard of the École Militaire in Paris, Dreyfus was subjected to a ceremony of public degradation. Imagine the scene, the cold Parisian air, the rows of silent soldiers, the sound of angry crowds shouting beyond the gates. Dreyfus was marched into the center. His uniform buttons were cut off, his officer's insignia ripped from his sleeves. And then, a non-commissioned officer took his sword, the symbol of his career and his honor, and broke it over his knee. The sharp snap of steel echoed in the silence. Dreyfus, maintaining his innocence, cried out. He shouted, Soldiers, they are degrading an innocent man. Long live France, long live the army. But it was no use. He was shipped away for life to the most desolate, isolated, and feared penal colony in the world, Devil's Island, a tiny, sun-scorched rock off the coast of South America. There, he lived in a small stone hut. He was isolated, watched day and night. He paced his small confines, a lone figure under a relentless sun, writing desperate letters to his family, proclaiming his innocence. The state had not just imprisoned him, it had tried to erase him. Back in France, the army believed the matter was finished, but it was only beginning. A new head of military intelligence, Colonel Picourt, began to look into the case, and he made a terrible discovery. He found evidence that the real traitor was still active. A man named Ferdinand Walson Esterhazy. Picourt, a man of conscience, brought this information to his superiors. He expected them to right this terrible wrong. Instead, he was met with a wall of silence. The Army High Command, terrified of the scandal and committed to its own infallibility, made a fatal choice. They chose to protect the institution, even if it meant sacrificing an innocent man. They covered it up. Picourt himself was punished, transferred to a dangerous post in North Africa. But the truth, however, slowly began to leak out. Dreyfus's family, his brother Matthew, fought tirelessly. They gathered allies, journalists, and politicians who began to question the army's verdict. Slowly, tentatively, France began to split into two bitterly opposed camps. On one side were the anti-Dreyfusards. They were nationalists, traditionalists, and often openly anti-Semitic. They believed in the honor of the army above all else. To them, questioning the verdict was an attack on France itself. They saw Dreyfus's guilt as a settled fact, and his defenders as traitors. On the other side were the Dreyfusards. They were intellectuals, Republicans, and reformers. They believed that the ideals of the Republic, the ideals of justice and truth, were more important than the army's reputation. They saw in Dreyfus's case a terrible injustice, a cancer of anti-Semitism and militarism growing at the heart of the nation. The affair moved out of the government offices and into the streets. The sound of angry crowds became a common feature of Parisian life. Shouts of death to Dreyfus were met with cries of long live justice. The press, now a powerful force, fanned the flames. Newspapers took sides, publishing scathing editorials and cartoons. This was no longer a simple legal case. It was a cultural and political civil war. It was a battle for the soul of France. Families were split. Friends of decades stopped speaking. A bitter argument over dinner could end a relationship forever. The polite, refined society of the Belle Époque was showing its teeth. Then, in January of 1898, the battle exploded into the open. The great writer, Émile Zola, one of the most famous novelists in the world, took the ultimate risk. He published an open letter to the President of France on the front page of a newspaper. The headline, 2 words in enormous type, would become legendary. J'accuse, I accuse. Imagine the smell of the printing press that morning, the rumble of the machines as they ran off thousands upon thousands of copies. The newsboys shouting the headline on the boulevards. In the letter, Zola did the unthinkable. He directly accused the highest-ranking generals of the army by name. He accused them of conspiracy, of covering up the truth, and of knowingly condemning an innocent man. It was a thunderclap. Zola knew exactly what he was doing. He was intentionally committing libel, forcing the government to arrest him. He wanted to be put on trial, not for his own sake, but to use the courtroom as a platform to present the evidence of Dreyfus's innocence to the entire world. The trial of Émile Zola became the trial of the affair itself. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. It was quiet, but heavy with tension. Lawyers argued, witnesses lied, and Zola sat with defiant composure. Outside, the crowds roared. The nation was holding its breath. Zola was, as expected, found guilty of libel. To avoid imprisonment, he was forced to flee his beloved country. He escaped to England, living in exile, his reputation in tatters, but his conscience clear. His gamble, however, had worked. The cover-up was irrevocably broken. The case could no longer be ignored. The scandal raged for years. It brought down governments. It saw street riots and duels. It exposed the rampant anti-Semitism that so many in enlightened society had preferred to ignore. Finally, the weight of the truth became too much for the army to bear. Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island in 1899, a frail, sickly man, but unbroken. In a flawed compromise, he was pardoned by the president, an act that saved him but did not clear his name. It was not until 1906, 12 years after his ordeal began, that Alfred Dreyfus was fully and officially exonerated. He was reinstated into the army, his honor restored. The affair was over, but it left deep, permanent scars on the French Republic. It had been a fever that revealed the fragility of the Golden Age, a reminder that beneath the progress and the light, ancient hatreds and powerful, unaccountable forces were still at work. This deep social divide was not the only source of fear. A different anxiety haunted the boulevards. It was a more immediate, physical, and unpredictable threat. It was the shadow of political violence, the fear of the anarchists' bomb. While the Belle Époque is remembered for its gaiety, the 1890s in particular were known by another name. They were the era of the Attente, or the attack. A small, radical faction of the anarchist movement had embraced a terrifying new doctrine. They called it the propaganda of the deed. They believed that the bourgeois state was so corrupt and the public so asleep that only violent, shocking acts could wake them up. They believed that a well-placed bomb or an assassin's knife could inspire a full-scale revolution. They were a tiny minority. Most anarchists were peaceful philosophers, dreamers of a world based on mutual aid and cooperation. But this violent fringe, this dark shadow, came to define the entire movement in the public's imagination. The fear was not abstract, it was terrifyingly real. In Paris, a figure named Ravachol became a symbol of this new terror. In 1892, he carried out a series of bombings, targeting the homes of judges and prosecutors who had been involved in cases against anarchists. He was eventually caught, tried, and sent to the guillotine, but his execution only inspired more attacks. The public was gripped by a new kind of dread. Where would the next bomb be? The targets were often symbols of bourgeois life: a fashionable restaurant, a theater, the stock exchange. People began to look at strangers on the street with suspicion. A package left unattended on a bench could cause a panic. Then, in 1893, the threat struck at the heart of the Republic itself. An anarchist named Auguste Vaillant entered the French Chamber of Deputies, the equivalent of the House of Representatives. He stood in the public gallery, overlooking the assembly of politicians, and threw a small bomb filled with nails and pellets onto the floor below. The explosion was sudden and shocking. The sound of the blast, the tinkle of falling glass from the chandeliers, the cries of the injured. Miraculously, no one was killed, though several deputies were wounded. Valent was arrested and, like Ravachol, executed. When asked about the people he had injured, he gave a chilling, detached answer. There are no innocent bourgeois. The terror reached its peak just a few months later. In 1894, the President of France, Sadi Carnot, was visiting the city of Lyon. He was riding in an open-topped carriage, waving to the crowds. A young Italian anarchist named Sancte Caserio pushed through the police line, jumped onto the carriage's running board, and fatally stabbed the president. The assassination of a head of state sent a shockwave of fear and outrage across the world. This was not a French problem. It was an international phenomenon. This propaganda of the deed was inspiring radicals everywhere. In 1898, Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Hungary, the beloved Sissi, was assassinated by an Italian anarchist while walking by a lake in Geneva. In 1901, United States President William McKinley was shot and killed by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York. Kings, queens, and presidents felt like they were under siege. The public was terrified. They imagined anarchists as shadowy, cloaked figures carrying round fizzing bombs, just as they were depicted in popular novels by writers like Joseph Conrad and G.K. Chesterton. The fear led to a predictable and harsh reaction. Governments across Europe passed new, repressive laws. In France, they were known as the lois scélérates, the villainous laws. These were some of the first anti-terrorism laws in modern history. They cracked down on the press, making it illegal to publish anything that could be seen as sympathetic to anarchism. They expanded the power of the police, allowing for widespread surveillance and summary arrests. The boulevards of Paris, once symbols of carefree leisure, now saw a new sight. Police checkpoints, officers searching carriages and stopping pedestrians. The whispered, fearful conversations in cafes were not just about the Dreyfus affair. They were about the latest attentat. People spoke in hushed tones about the fragility of their world. The quiet, tense atmosphere of a city on edge was the other, darker side of the Belle Époque. This glittering age of light and progress was also an age of sudden, shocking violence. It was a time when a single, alienated man could, with a simple, devastating act, bring the entire machinery of the state to a halt. The fear was real. It was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the music of the cafes and the laughter of the dance halls. While these internal fears preoccupied the public, the great powers of Europe were also looking outwards. They were competing for influence and territory in a great global game of empires. This was the high noon of imperialism. The Belle Époque, this period of immense wealth and confidence in Europe, corresponded almost exactly with the era of new imperialism. The prosperity and industrial might celebrated at the great expositions were built, in no small part, on a vast global system of colonial control. The driving force behind this was the scramble for Africa. In 1884, the major European powers had gathered for the Berlin Conference. There, in a quiet, orderly meeting room, they had laid a map of Africa on a table. With rulers and pencils, they drew lines across the continent, dividing it amongst themselves. These lines, drawn with no regard for the ancient cultures, languages, or geographies of the people who lived there, carved Africa into a patchwork of European possessions. This scramble was driven by a powerful mix of motives. There was the economic engine. The factories of Europe were hungry for raw materials like rubber, cotton, and copper. and they needed new markets to sell their finished goods. But just as powerful was the motive of national prestige. To be a great power meant having an empire. The image of the world map was a source of immense national pride. A schoolboy in London could look at a globe and see vast swaths of it colored pink, the color of the British Empire. He would be taught that the sun never set on it. A schoolgirl in Paris would see a map with huge areas of blue, representing the vast French colonial holdings in West and North Africa. This competition was not a friendly one. It was a source of intense international rivalry. Britain famously dreamed of an unbroken line of territory from Cape to Cairo, a railway that would run the entire length of the continent. France, pushing east from its possessions in the West, had its own ambitions. These competing dreams nearly led to war. In 1898, in a remote, sun-baked village in Sudan called Fashoda, a small French military expedition encountered a much larger British force. The two columns, exhausted from their treks, faced each other in the middle of nowhere. For several weeks, the capitals of London and Paris were locked in a tense diplomatic standoff. Newspapers demanded war. It was a crisis that brought two of the world's most civilized nations to the brink of conflict over a patch of mud. Eventually, France backed down, a national humiliation that deepened the tensions between the two powers. This imperial project was brought home to the public through a new and disturbing form of entertainment, the colonial exposition. At the great world's fairs, like the one in Paris in 1900, special pavilions were built to showcase the empires. They would recreate native villages. These were, in reality, human zoos. People from Africa and Asia were brought over and put on display, living in constructed huts, performing rituals for the amusement of gawking crowds. These displays reinforced the racist stereotypes of the day. They presented the colonial subjects as primitive, exotic, and in need of the civilizing hand of European rule. The immense profits from these colonies flowed back to Europe, fueling the very lifestyle of the Belle Époque. The rubber from the brutal plantations of the Congo, a personal fiefdom of Belgium's King Leopold, ended up as tires for the new bicycles and automobiles on the Parisian boulevards. The diamonds from South Africa adorned the necks of women in the glittering opera houses. The quiet pride of a bourgeois family, whose wealth came from a distant plantation, was built on this system of exploitation. The exotic, unfamiliar smells of spices, teas, and coffee, which now filled the grand new department stores, were a direct result of this global reach. But this system was not maintained by trade alone. It was maintained by force. The Boer War, which broke out in 1899, was a brutal, costly, and widely reported conflict. The British Empire, in its quest to control the rich gold and diamond mines of South Africa, found itself in a grinding war against the Boers, tough, independent settlers of Dutch descent. The war dragged on for 3 years, revealing the harsh realities of modern combat. This imperial high noon gave the public a sense of racial and cultural superiority. It was a bedrock of their confidence, but it was also a source of constant, low-level military tension, and it created new rivalries. The new, unified nation of Germany, a latecomer to the imperial game, looked at this map with envy. It felt left out of the colonial prizes, a feeling that would dangerously fuel its own ambitions. This global rivalry, this competition for resources and prestige, was not just happening in distant lands. It was coming home. It was taking the form of new technologies, new ships, and a new uneasy feeling. A feeling that came to be known as the armed peace. This is the final, and perhaps the greatest, paradox of the Belle Époque. The period from 1871, the end of the Franco-Prussian War, to 1914, was one of the longest stretches of unbroken peace between the great powers in modern European history. For over 40 years, there was no major war between France, Germany, Britain, and Russia. This long peace was what allowed the arts, the sciences, and the culture of the era to flourish. It was the soil in which the beautiful epoch grew. And yet, this exact same period was also the largest, most expensive, and most technologically advanced arms race the world had ever seen. The peace was not a peace of friendship. It was a peace of fear. It was an armed peace. The most visible sign of this was the great Anglo-German naval race. Germany, under its ambitious and volatile leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was jealous of Britain's global empire. The Kaiser believed that for Germany to be a true world power, it needed a navy to rival Britain's Royal Navy. So, Germany began a massive program of battleship construction. Britain, an island nation whose entire empire depended on control of the seas, saw this as an existential threat. The British government responded with a revolutionary new weapon. In 1906, it launched a battleship so new, so powerful, and so fast that it made every other warship in the world obsolete overnight. It was called His Majesty's Ship Dreadnought. The shadow of this giant gray ship, sitting in a harbor, was a symbol of the age. It was a marvel of the same industrial power that built the Eiffel Tower, but its only purpose was destruction. The naval race was on. For every ship Germany built, Britain vowed to build to the hammering in the shipyards of Hamburg and Glasgow was a constant, ominous percussion beneath the music of the era. And it was not just ships. On land, the armies were larger than ever. Relying on universal conscription, the draft, nations built up vast, standing armies of millions of men. These were not just paper armies. They had plans. In the quiet offices of the general staffs, military planners drew up intricate, detailed timetables for a war they all insisted would never happen. The German Schlieffen Plan was a precise minute-by-minute guide on how to invade France through neutral Belgium before turning to fight Russia. The French Plan 17 was its own detailed plan for an immediate all-offensive to recapture the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. The continent was being wired for war. A complex, rigid, and often secret system of alliances divided Europe into two massive armed camps. On one side was the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other was the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Great Britain. These alliances were meant to keep the peace, a system of mutual deterrence, but they were, in reality, a series of tripwires. If one nation went to war, its allies were legally bound to join in. A small regional conflict could now automatically pull the entire continent into a general catastrophe. The powder keg of Europe, as it was known, was the Balkans. This volatile region saw a series of small, nasty crises and wars in the years leading up to 1914. These were like small tremors before the earthquake, each one testing the fragile alliance system. Many people, of course, simply could not believe a major war was possible. In 1910, a writer named Norman Angell published a runaway bestseller called The Great Illusion. His argument was simple and, it seemed, logical. He argued that the economies of Europe were so interconnected, so dependent on each other, that a war would be economically futile. It would ruin everyone, victor and vanquished alike. Many people read this and nodded. War, they believed, was obsolete. And yet, at the very same time, a different spirit was growing. A new, aggressive nationalism. Many young men, bored with the decadence of the age, saw war as a noble adventure, a cleansing fire that would test their manhood and restore honor to the world. And so, the stage was set. The long, beautiful summer of 1914 arrived. Imagine a sunny afternoon in a Parisian park in July of that year. Children are playing. Families are enjoying picnics. No one is aware of the coming catastrophe. The newspapers rustle gently. There are small, unalarming headlines about a political assassination in a faraway, obscure city called Sarajevo. In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was shot by a young Serbian nationalist. It was the spark. The intricate, interlocking system of alliances, the tripwires, clicked into place, one by one. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia, Serbia's ally, mobilized its army. Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally, declared war on Russia. France, Russia's ally, was drawn in. And when Germany enacted its Schlieffen Plan and invaded Belgium, Britain, pledged to protect Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. The house of cards, built during 40 years of armed peace, collapsed in a matter of weeks. In August 1914, the guns of August began to fire. The Belle Époque, the beautiful epoch, was over. The glittering age, it turned out, was dancing on the edge of a volcano. The same industrial energies that created the palace of electricity also forged the great new battleships, and the same mass media that celebrated artists also fanned the flames of nationalism. These distant rumbles were the quiet, ominous soundtrack to the era. Let these complex thoughts drift away like clouds passing. They are just history now. As you settle deeper into comfort, we'll explore one last, wondrous aspect of this changing world. A quiet look at the gentle magic of new inventions. Rest well, and so we drift. Let all the thoughts of empires, of anxieties, and of great crowds fade away. Let them dissolve like sugar in warm water. They are gone. We are turning the page to the final, quietest chapter of our journey. This is a place of calm, a place of wonder, a museum of curiosities viewed from the comfort of your rest. The world we have been visiting was not just a world of art and light. It was a world of whispers, whispers of a future that was arriving, piece by piece, in strange and magical new forms. Let's explore these gentle marvels, not as grand historical events, but as quiet, personal moments of wonder. Let your mind drift, and let's listen to the first of these whispers. The sound of a voice in a wire. Imagine a room in a fine Parisian apartment. It is quiet. On the wall there is a strange object. It is made of polished, dark wood, perhaps oak or walnut. It has brass fittings, gleaming softly in the gaslight. There is a small, black cone, a mouthpiece, and a separate, heavy earpiece, connected by a thick, braided cord. This is the telephone. In the Belle Époque, this was not a common object. It was a luxury, a curiosity, a marvel. For most of its early life, it was a tool for the wealthy, for big businesses, for stockbrokers, or for connecting a factory to its owner's office. It was not a part of daily, ordinary life, not yet. To use it was a ritual. It was not simple. You could not just dial a number. There was no dial. There was just this box. To begin, you would perhaps have to turn a small crank on the side, a little handle that generated a small electrical charge. Or you would simply lift the heavy, cold receiver from its brass hook, and then you would wait. You would put the receiver to your ear, a cold, hard vulcanite cup, and you would speak into the cone. You would say, "Hello," or, in Paris, "J'écoute, I'm listening." You were not speaking to your friend, not yet. You were speaking to a new kind of person, a professional listener, a demoiselle du téléphone, a hello girl. In the first exchanges, like the one that opened in Paris in 1879, the system was entirely manual. It was a vast, complex, human-operated network. In a large, central office, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of young women sat in long, straight rows. They sat before a towering wall of brass holes, a switchboard. Each hole was a life, a business, a connection. These operators were the unseen gears of the new machine. They were chosen carefully. They had to be polite. They had to be patient. And above all, they had to have clear, calm, reassuring voices. They were the voice of the technology. So, in your quiet room, you would hear a click, and then a voice in your ear. A calm, clear, female voice, slightly robotic. "Numero s'il vous plaît," number, please. And you would tell her. You would give the name or the number of the person you wished to reach. "I would like to speak to Monsieur Dubois," and she, in her distant, busy room, would take a long braided patch cord. She would take one plug, and with a sharp, metallic click, she would push it into the hole that represented your line. Then she would take the other end and find the hole for Monsieur Dubois and plug it in. She was the bridge. She was physically connecting you to people across the city with a piece of wire. Then you would wait. You might hear a small, distant ringing sound, and then ... another voice. This was the true magic. This was the true, unnerving miracle. It was the voice of your friend, your colleague, your grandmother, but it was not with them. It was a voice without a body, a disembodied presence, traveling instantly across miles of cable, strung over the rooftops of the city. The sound quality was not like it is today. It was a ghost of a voice. It was faint, tinny. It was full of static, a sound like frying, a constant crackle and hiss. You might hear echoes, strange whispers of other conversations, other ghosts on the line. The operators, you knew, could listen in. Privacy was a new, modern concern. They could hear your secrets, your business deals, your family news. But you would lean in, pressing the cold receiver hard against your ear. You would shout into the black cone, "Are you there? Can you hear me?" And the tinny, distant voice would shout back, "Yes, I am here. It is me." The great writer, Marcel Proust, a man who lived deep within the Belle Époque, was fascinated by this. He was haunted by it. He wrote about the telephone as a supernatural instrument. He described the frustration of the connection, but the magic of the voice. He wrote about calling his grandmother and hearing her presence come to him, separate from her physical self. It was, he felt, a miracle, a way of touching someone without being near them. It was a strange new intimacy and a strange new distance. You were connected, but you were also alone in a quiet room, talking to a piece of polished wood and cold brass. The telephone was conquering distance. It was shrinking the city. It was turning the world into a network of wires. It was the first gentle whisper of a truly modern life. Let that thought rest. The sound of the crackling wire, the tinny voice, ... let it fade. The telephone conquered distance. But another new discovery, a new kind-off light, was about to conquer the very boundary of our own skin. It was a discovery that would allow us to see the invisible, to see, quite literally, through solid matter. Our scene shifts. We are no longer in Paris. We are in a laboratory, in Germany, in the year 1895. It is November. A physicist named Wilhelm Röntgen is working late. His laboratory is dark, as it needs to be for his experiments. He is working with a piece of equipment called a cathode ray tube. It is a sealed glass tube with the air pumped out. He is running a high-voltage current through it, studying the strange, glowing rays it produces. His tube is covered in thick, black cardboard to block all the visible light. The room is in complete darkness. He is studying the glow, but then he notices something. Across the room, on a workbench, something else is glowing. A small, fluorescent screen, a piece of paper coated in special chemicals, is glimmering. It is shining with a faint, pale, greenish light. Röntgen is a scientist. He is methodical. This should not be happening. The tube is covered. No visible light can be escaping. He turns off the tube. The glow stops. He turns the tube back on. The glow returns. He is puzzled and intrigued. Some new, unknown, invisible ray must be coming from the tube. A ray that can pass, without effort, through the thick, black cardboard. He calls it, simply, X-ray. X for unknown. He spends the next few weeks in a fever of discovery. He stays in his lab, working in secret. He tries to block this new ray. He puts his hand in front of the tube. The rays pass through his hand. He holds up a piece of paper. The rays pass through a piece of wood. The rays pass through a thin sheet of metal. The rays are blocked. He realizes what this means. He is not just seeing a glow. He is seeing through things. He calls for his wife, Anna Bertha. He asks her to come to his dark laboratory. The air is still, with the low, electric hum of the equipment. There is a strange, sharp smell in the air. The smell of ozone, generated by the high voltage. He asks her to place her hand on a photographic plate, a plate designed to capture images with light. Then, he turns on his cathode ray tube and aims the invisible X-rays at her hand for several minutes. He develops the plate, and what they see changes the world. It is a photograph, but it is a photograph of the unsealed. It is the first X-ray image of a human. It is a ghostly, skeletal image of his wife's hand. You can see the bones, the delicate, pale shapes of her fingers, her wrist, and on her ring finger, a dark, solid shape, her wedding ring. The metal has blocked the rays. Anna Bertha is horrified. She looks at this ghostly picture, this photograph of her own skeleton. She reportedly says, "I have seen my death." Röntgen knows his secret is too big to keep. He publishes his findings. Within weeks, the news is not just a scientific curiosity. It is a global sensation. The world is electrified and terrified by this new, ghostly vision. The public's imagination runs wild. They are amazed. They are slightly horrified. The idea that someone could see through your clothes, through your very flesh, it is a violation. It is supernatural. Almost immediately, the X-ray becomes a form of entertainment. Fairgrounds and music halls set up X-ray demonstrations. For a small fee, you can step into a dark booth, place your hand under a machine, and look through a viewer. You can see the pale, shimmering bones inside your own living hand. It is a thrill, a new kind of magic show. People are awestruck. They feel a slight, cold shiver It is uncanny. It is a vision of the part of yourself that you are never meant to see. Jokers and entrepreneurs market extra-proof underwear, playing on the public's modest fears, though these are OFC, or worse, a hoax. Doctors, however, see its value instantly. This is not just entertainment. This is a medical miracle. For the first time, a surgeon can see a broken bone without cutting open the skin. They can find a bullet lodged deep in a soldier's body. But this magic has a dark side, one that is not yet understood. The dangers of radiation are completely unknown. The early X-ray operators, the pioneers, are heroes and martyrs. They would often test their machines by placing their own hands in the beam for minutes, even hours at a time. They would hold up their hands to the fluorescent screen to show the public. They do not know that these invisible rays are burning them. They are cooking them from the inside. Many of them suffer terrible burns, their skin peeling away, and later they develop strange, aggressive cancers. They are the first victims of the atomic age, an age that has not even been named. But in the Belle Époque, it is a marvel. It is a symbol of a new power. Science has given humanity a kind of divine sight. We can now see the invisible. We can see through the veil of reality into the very framework of our bodies. It is a strange, pale, greenish glow in a darkened room, and it is the whisper of a new and powerful and dangerous future. Let the ghostly image fade. Let the electric hum grow quiet. We had learned to see through flesh. We had learned to send our voices through wires. All that remained was to conquer the one realm that had always, since the beginning of time, been forbidden to us, the sky. Our story now, this dreamy, slow-paced reflection, moves to a field, a grassy field, near the town of Le Mans, in France. The year is 1908. For centuries, for millennia, humanity had dreamed of flying. We told stories of it. Icarus, flying too close to the sun. The dream was as old as our species, but it was always a dream, a fantasy. In the Belle Époque, that fantasy became an obsession, especially in France. They even had a new word for it: aviation. Hot air balloons, of course, had been around for a century, but they were not flying. They were floating, drifting at the mercy of the wind. The challenge was heavier than air flight: to build a machine, a true aeroplane that could take off and turn and land under its own power. French pioneers like Louis Blériot and Alberto Santos Dumont had been making progress. They built fragile, bizarre contraptions, machines made of wood and bicycle wheels and canvas. They would take them to fields and try to make them fly. They would sputter and rattle. They would lift off the ground for a few feet, a hop. They would fly for 100 yards and then crash in a tangle of broken wood and wire. They were brave, they were celebrated, but they were not truly flying. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in America, two brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright, had already solved the problem. In 1903, on a cold, windy beach at Kitty Hawk, they had made the first controlled, sustained flight. But the world had hardly noticed. They were secretive, and their own country was largely uninterested. So, in 1908, Wilbur Wright came to France. He came to show the skeptics, the obsessed French aviators, what he could do. He brought his machine, the Wright Flyer. It was, like the French machines, a fragile thing of wood and canvas and wire. The pilot did not sit inside. He lay flat on the lower wing, exposed to the elements. The crowd gathered at the Honadiers racetrack. They were curious, but they were skeptical. They expected another short, straight-line hop. Wilbur Wright started the engine. It was a small, sputtering, noisy thing. You could smell the hot castor oil. You could hear the rattle of the wooden frame, the buzz of the two large propellers. The machine moved forward, rolling on a simple launching rail, and then it lifted. It lifted off the grass. It was not just a hop. It climbed 10 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet. It flew, not just in a straight line, but it turned. Wilbur, lying on the wing, simply shifted his hips, pulling on the wires. And the machine, this kite, this contraption, banked in the air. It tilted gracefully and circled the field. The crowd below was silent. They were stunned. This was not a hop. This was not a stunt. This was flight. True, controlled, graceful flight. A man was circling in the sky as easily as a bird. A French aviator who was watching that day, one of the pioneers, would later describe the feeling. He said, simply, "We were as children." Everything had changed. In that single moment, the world was new. Wilbur Wright stayed aloft that day, and in the days that followed, for minutes at a time, sometimes for over an hour, he would circle the field, a small, fragile, rattling object, a new, human-made moon in the afternoon sky. The gasps of the crowd below were the sound of a dream coming true, humanity's oldest, most impossible dream. The public went wild. Aviation was no longer a hobby for eccentrics. It was the future. The very next year, in 1909, Louis Blériot, the French pioneer, was inspired. He built a new machine, and he did something of immense symbolic power. He became the first person to fly an aeroplane across the English Channel. Imagine that flight, alone, in a fragile machine, over the cold, gray water, guided only by sight, the engine sputtering, the wind tearing at the canvas wings. When he landed, crashing on the white cliffs of Dover, he was a global hero. He had not just crossed a body of water. He had proven that the sky no longer belonged only to the birds. The first air meets and aviation shows became the biggest public spectacles of the age. Thousands of people would gather in a field just to watch these new birdmen risk their lives, to see their fragile machines take to the air. The feeling of the wind on the pilot's face, the smell of the glue and the canvas, the fragile sound of the wooden frame straining against the air. This was the sound of a new age. Of course, this beautiful dream, like the X-ray, had its shadow. Just 6 years later, in 1914, these same wonderful machines, these symbols of human ingenuity, would be used for the first time in war. They would carry bombs. They would mount machine guns. The conquest of the air, like all the other conquests, was a double-edged sword. But, for a moment, in the beautiful epoch, it was pure wonder. It was the sight of a small, kite-like object, circling gracefully in the summer sky, and the sound of 10,000 people holding their breath as they watched. Let the sound of the sputtering engine fade. Let the image of the circling plane drift away, seeing the invisible, hearing voices in wires, flying through the air. These new marvels were also changing our very perception of the world itself. They were changing the most fundamental and most invisible framework of our lives, time. Our final, quiet reflection is not on a machine you can see. It is on an idea, the idea of clock time. Before the Belle Époque, before the 19th century, time was not a single, unified thing. Time was local. Time was natural. Each town, each village, set its own time. When the sun was at its highest point in the sky, that was noon. A church bell would ring. The town would set its public clock. This meant that noon in Paris was different from noon in Brest. a town on the western coast of France. They were separated by geography, and so they were separated by time. Noon in Brest was several minutes after noon in Paris. This did not matter. For centuries, it did not matter at all. Life was slow. Travel was slow. A carriage ride from one town to the next took days. What did a few minutes matter? But then a new machine arrived, the railway, and the railway and its companion, the telegraph, changed everything. The railway companies had a terrible problem. They needed to create timetables. But how can you create a timetable when every single station on the line has a different noon? How can you tell a passenger the train will arrive at 10:03 when 10:03 in one town is 10:01 in the next? It was a nightmare of confusion. The world, now connected by fast-moving trains and instant messaging telegraphs, could no longer run on local sun time. It needed a new time, a single, unified, mechanical time. The first to do this was Great Britain. The railway companies, led by the Great Western Railway, adopted a single, standard time for all their timetables. They called it railway time. It was the time of the Greenwich Observatory in London. Slowly, this Greenwich Mean Time became the standard time for the entire country. The old, local sun time began to fade away, a relic of a slower, pre-industrial age. The rest of the world had to follow. In 1884, a crucial but little-known meeting was held. The International Meridian Conference took place in Washington, D.C. Its goal was to tame time for the entire planet. They established the system we use to this very day. The world was divided into 24 time zones. A prime meridian, the 0.4 all-world time, was chosen. That 0 point was Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT. The new industrial world, a world of factories, of telegraphs, of global shipping, now had a single, unified, mechanical pulse. Not everyone was happy. France, in particular, was resistant. It did not want to adopt the time of its great rival, Britain. For decades, France proudly held onto Paris time. Paris time was, precisely, 9 minutes and 21 seconds ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. It was a small, symbolic act of defiance, but it could not last. The modern world was too connected. In 1911, France finally and quietly gave up. It officially adopted the time of the Greenwich Meridian. The world's time was now one. For the ordinary person, this new time changed everything. The mass production of cheap, reliable pocket watches put a machine, a small, ticking heart, in everyone's hand. You could see time moving with unerring mechanical purpose. The day was no longer defined by the sun or the rhythms of the farm. It was defined by the distant sound of the factory whistle, a sound that told thousands of people, all at once, when to work, when to eat, and when to rest. The grand public clocks on the new railway stations were symbols of this new age. Their hands moved with a purpose that was absolute and universal. The telegraph operator, tapping out dots and dashes, would send time signals, synchronizing the clocks of an entire nation. This was the final, invisible framework of the modern world. A quiet, steady talk, a pulse that connected every train, every factory, every ship, and every person. A world of new sounds, new sights, and a new, unified time. The Belle Époque was not a static, golden photograph. It was a living, breathing, anxious, and exhilarating moment of profound change. The very beginning of the world we now know. But for now, that world is far away. All that matters is this moment, this quiet, and this comfort. Thank you for joining us on this journey tonight at Sleeping Scribe. It has been a true privilege to share this story with you. If you have enjoyed our exploration and are feeling sleepy and relaxed, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps our community grow, and it means the world to us. We hope our stories provide you with a peaceful and restful night. So, let your mind go. There are no more tasks, nothing left to do but to drift. Good night. Sleep well.